Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this special open access session of the Telos Learning Corps. For those of you who are new to Telos, we form communities of peacemakers across lines of difference and equip them to help reconcile seemingly intractable conflict at home and abroad. For those of you who know Telos but haven't come to a Learning Corps meeting yet, welcome. This is a special community we'd love to have you join. We've opened up this conversation to everyone who's interested today because we think it's a really timely and important one that we'd like everyone to be a part of. But if this type of conversation is one that resonates, if you're looking for a community like this to join long-term, to keep having these conversations, we'd love to have you. Today's call is part of an ongoing series of conversations and an orientation towards action where we advocate for human rights and a future of mutual flourishing for Israelis and Palestinians. The past few weeks, and especially this past week in Israel-Palestine, there's been an overwhelming number of instances of direct violence. I know I've been watching in horror, my colleagues have been watching in horror, as this direct violence escalates, which comes on top of the ongoing conditions that actively prevent mutual flourishing that exist even when these headlines aren't hitting us. Today, we're talking about and unpacking the relationship between the US government and the Israeli government, particularly because it's an important relationship to understand as American peacemakers who are committed to a future of mutual flourishing for Israelis and Palestinians, and who want to do something in this moment. This isn't just about understanding international diplomacy, it's about leveraging our agency for real change. In the context of today's conversation about how the US government's relationship with Israel comes into all of this, our hope is always to improve conditions for freedom, dignity, and security for all. Our work is about helping build something that better suits everyone, not tearing down or destroying existing relationships to the detriment of some. One important thing I also want to note up front is that as we talk about emphasizing human rights, especially regarding the US government's relationship with Israel, we also recognize and believe that a stronger human rights framework is essentially to continuing to combat anti-Semitism, which is on the rise in the US and Europe, and is something we take seriously as we advocate for mutual flourishing as well. Today's call will hopefully give you and us all some more context about what's happening in Israel-Palestine in this current moment, why we at Telos are disappointed in the US response, and how we as peacemakers can act in this moment to leverage the impact we can have as Americans to advocate for mutual flourishing in concrete ways beyond just preventing escalation. With me today, I've got two of my colleagues, Greg Khalil and Jack Saba. Both are incredibly knowledgeable, have a lot to say on this topic, and I'm really looking forward to this. I'll start with some questions for Greg and Jack, but I hope we get to some questions and answers from you all as well. We didn't want to know what's on your hearts and minds, what you're thinking, any places where you're confused or places you want to kind of push for more information. As those questions come to you, please drop them in the chat or send them directly to me, and we will try and ask those at the end. So Greg and Jack, thanks for joining us today. Greg, I want to start with you. If we think about the relationship between the US and Israel historically, what is it founded on? What's the most important thing to understand about it as peacemakers if we hope to advocate for mutual flourishing?
I think that's a big question, Sarah. I just want to first name one thing, that we're convening this call after a number of pretty significant escalations on the ground. And so I know we're going to come back to that. And so I feel answering that question is a little, you know, a little bit of, it feels a little awkward without just sort of like grounding ourselves in this reality that these things on the ground are happening that are very significant right now, I think, for all observers. And one of the ways that they are significant is the way that they're forcing I think many in the US and many communities in the US who care about Israel and care about Palestinians to reevaluate their historic relationship to Israel. What do I mean by that? I think, you know, we've often heard of this special US-Israel relationship. We often speak about it as being founded in core democratic values. I think many analysts will say that, well, you know, the real foundation of it is geopolitical. It's interest-based. There's a sense that Israel and the US have a shared set of interests, at least that they've identified historically, and therefore maintaining a close alliance helps helps to advance those interests. Those interests have historically been defined in various ways. Some relate to sort of, projecting power in the broader Middle East. The way that I think we often talk about this historically and publicly is this sense of the exceptionality of the American story and the exceptionality of the Israeli story, at least how these stories are popularly conceived and told, particularly given that Israel as a modern nation state was born in the aftermath of World War II, the Holocaust, and deep complicity of many international bodies, states, and multinational organizations like the League of Nations, the predecessor to the current United Nations, in turning a blind eye and doing nothing to stop so many of the atrocities that we saw in Europe, many of which obviously were perpetrated and focused against the Jewish people. And so there's this idea of this special relationship that's rooted historically in values, and then also common strategic interest. I think what's interesting in this moment right now, Sarah, is that many people, after this new Israeli government has come into power, which is by every estimation the most sort of right-wing government that has ever been formed in Israel, and doesn't even aspire to adhere to any human rights norms. After this administration sort of taking power, and after some of what we've seen on the ground, like in Nablus recently, which I see many, American Jewish supporters of Israel referring to as a pogrom, which is a significant use of language, that I think many people are starting to question if part of that alliance still holds. And that's this self-conception of two nations that have shared destinies and shared democratic interest, or if this alliance is being frayed as Israel is moving further away from democratic ideals that it once espoused.
I'm glad you mentioned the bedrock of shared values, Greg, and I think that's something we're going to come back to as we talk about what we can do in this moment, because having shared values makes it easier to push against and advocate for them. I also want to acknowledge, as you said, there's so much that we didn't touch on that's been happening. We don't have time to get into all of it, but I'll ask Jack to give us an update on that in a moment. But if you feel like you're a little bit behind, or you haven't been following exactly everything that's been happening in Israel, Palestine over the past few weeks, I'd encourage you to go back and look through Telos's newsletter and listen to the last few episodes of our check-in. We've tried to keep up to date with some of the major happenings and then also put those in a bigger context to help you understand. So not right now, please stay with us on this call, but afterwards, those are some further resources for learning if you hear us mention something and you want to do a little bit more digging. Before I turn to Jack to give us an updated context of where we are, I think it would be helpful as we keep talking about this relationship to understand why this is something Telos focuses on. So Greg, at Telos, we often talk about the fact that Israel-Palestine is a foreign policy issue, but it functions like a domestic issue. What do we mean by that? And where's the opportunity in that for us as peacemakers right now and more generally?
Yeah, this can sound a little bit theoretical, but I think it's really important for everyone on this call to understand, because what it does is it enables us to understand how we're connected, why this matters, and what our agency and power is. So I knew, I grew up Palestinian American, born and raised in San Diego, but as many of you know, I spent some years living in Ramallah in the West Bank, advising the Palestinian leadership on negotiations with Israel. And so I saw firsthand just how connected and how influential America was and is on the ground. We send billions of dollars to Israelis and Palestinians a year. We advocate for certain policy positions over a period of decades for that many would say help to preserve the status quo being this current situation in which we have the Israeli government supporting and entrenching occupation and settlements, what many international human rights organizations are even referring to as an apartheid regime right now. And so the question comes to why. Is it simply because there's a strategic interest in, relationship with Israel? Is it simply because, there's shared values? We have shared values and strategic relationships with many countries around the world. So what is it that makes this relationship with Israel the focus of so much energy and attention from the US government in particular over a period of decades? Is it just this sort of analysis that we were getting at earlier? And the answer, I think, is very clearly, well, there's something else at play here. And so, Israel is a foreign policy issue. What that means is that, typically the executive branch, the president, the State Department, they really they do the legwork in defining what America's policy, how we relate to most foreign policy issues. So think like, say, North Korea's nuclear weapons. We're not having church picnics on Sundays around North Korea's nuclear weapons. That's like a classic foreign policy subject. But, sorry for the quip, but, Israel is something that figures prominently in many of our communities, whether or not they're Jewish or Arab, often Christian communities, which is a big focus of Telos's work. As many know here, you'll go into church and you'll see Israeli flags flying there. So Israel is almost unique among foreign policy issues in that part of the reason why the US supports certain postures towards Israel and so much money going towards Israel and the Palestinians and the current status quo is because a lot of Americans really care about it. And they show up and they advocate and they organize and they put their money towards it. And it's, subsets of certain communities. It's not, so there's a significant percentage of organized American Jewry who really cares about Israel in a variety of different ways. And so there's a lot of diversity there in terms of supporting everything for Palestinian human rights. Up to the settlements, but there are segments of that community that are very well organized. Communities where we have more expertise are Christian communities, particularly evangelical Christians, and there's tens of millions of dollars going every year to some of these causes that we're going to be talking about in a second, like the settlements from these communities, and they're organized. And so when you ask me like how is Israel Palestine a domestic issue? It's a domestic issue in the sense that like a lot of Americans, many Americans, most Americans don't know or care that much about it, but a significant portion do. And they make their voices heard. And they make their voices heard in particular ways. And the ways that most Americans who've advocated on this issue have showed up and really organized have been in ways to at least support the status quo, a default pro-Israel position, which I personally, and I think many people don't think ultimately is pro-Israel. And that's maybe another discussion to have. But the point that I want to leave you with in answering your question is what it means when something's a domestic issue is that a lot of us on this call, we have a lot more power. Because we have the power to speak up, to organize, to help others see that there's another story here, that it's not just black and white, one side versus the other, that there's more complexity here, that we as Americans are actually connected to this issue, that it's not something that's just happening, thousands of miles away, that we affect it, that we're a party to this conflict as well, and that we've incorporated it into our own culture, into our own institutions, into our own houses of worship, and so that we have a real interest and responsibility engaging this differently. So I think that knowing that it's a domestic issue means that we have power and increased responsibility, and particularly to finally help reframe this as a human rights issue affecting Israelis and Palestinians. Obviously, in the current moment, Palestinians are at the receiving brunt of most of the human rights violations, but viewing it through that lens, I think will finally help our politicians, from President Biden to whomever the next president is, to our members of Congress, to behave in a way that helps to repair rather than exacerbate the conflict.
Thanks very much for that context, Greg. And we'll return to some of those points you said later about the fact that we do care and we do have influence. And that's what we're hoping to harness in this moment later on. But I want to turn now and then bring Jack into the conversation to some of the concrete things we've been seeing, and to have you give us a little bit of an update on how we've arrived at this moment, what some of the major events and factors are. None of us are experts on the Israeli elections. I've been following the news and I am far from an expert. So Jack, between the protests we've seen about this latest Israeli election, between the increase in direct violence over the past few weeks, can you give us an overview of some of the factors that have been escalating what's been going on?
Yeah, sure. A lot of factors. So, but this past Israeli election brought a government that is first and foremost led by the now widely despised and divisive Netanyahu. And for Netanyahu to have been elected, he really relied, or not elected, but successful in forming a coalition. He relied on some of the most kind of xenophobic, ideological, and frankly, violent figures in Israeli politics. Now, to be clear, these aren't just politicians whom I disagree with or hold opinions I disagree with, like the Otzma Yehudit party, which translates to Jewish Strength Party, is led by people that have been young activists in the Kahana party. So for those that are not familiar with Kahana, he was an American Israeli Orthodox rabbi that served a term in the Israeli Knesset in the 80s, but then he was convicted of acts of terrorism by Israel. And so all Kahanist activity was outlawed in Israel and in the US. So these are really problematic figures, political figures in that sense. But yet, in order for Netanyahu to remain in power, he brought these essentially terrorist group affiliated politicians into the governing coalition. Now, I want to stop there for a second, because that's what happened in the elections, and that's how this government is different than previous government. But the previous Israeli government was also run by the former head of the Judea and Samaria Council, or AKA the settlements, right? And it was under his watch that Israel last year killed more than 150 Palestinians, making it the deadliest year for Palestinians under occupation since 2007, which was kind of the height of or since the Second Intifada, essentially. Including the killing of the Palestinian American journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, right? And there hasn't been there's been a refusal to open an investigation or punish those people that have been responsible. That was all under the previous government. And I'm mentioning all this not to downplay the severity of this current government, but to really put things into context of at what point in time this current government is escalating the violence even further, right? Because what we've been having happen with every Israeli election is that we have every successive government trying to sort of outperform the previous government when it comes to the holy grail of Israeli politics, and that's the word security. And it's usually this other thing called security through deterrence. And deterrence in this case translates to, we're going to hit Palestinians so hard that they'll think twice before thinking to hit back. And with that, you have this latest phase of that kind of deterrence policy in the form of a pogrom, as many are calling it, on a number of Palestinian villages by dozens of young settlers that went out to burn, attack, and also killed a man, a 37-year-old, as part of those attacks. And these settlers had set out to avenge the death of two young brothers that were killed outside of Nablus as they were driving home to their home in a settlement just near Nablus. And I was watching this in real time. I was watching it on social media, kind of a live stream, and it was scary, and still is scary to think that this is the reality we were living in. But as I was watching it kind of on my phone and panicking and thinking this is out of control, I get a phone call from my parents that are actually living on the outskirts of Ramallah and in a Palestinian town there. And they were in complete panic mode because the house right across the street was set ablaze. And it was just such a stark reminder that, how extremely close everything is. And so it just got really close to home for my family. And that's the reality that this government and this election has created. And it seems like both a very scary moment, but also a moment that has great potential for change, because of the mass protest movement that we've been seeing, and everything else.
Thanks for sharing all of that, Jack, and especially the story about your parents. I think that's one thing that is easy to miss, especially as we watch all of these headlines and you see numbers and reports that this affects people we know, if you traveled, people we know, if you know Jack through our Telos webinars and all of our partners on the ground. And these are our friends, these are our partners. These aren't just people who are half a world away that we care about abstractly. So thanks for sharing that, Jack. I want us to come back to what you were talking about, security through deterrence, a little bit later. I think that's a really important conversation to have, especially as an organization that cares about freedom, dignity, and security for Israelis and Palestinians. But first, I want to touch a little bit on the Biden administration's response to what you just laid out and described. Not just an escalation over the past 3 or 4 weeks, but this increased, deterrence, pressure, violence over the past few elected governments. We've seen the U.S. response to this across administrations, but even within the Biden administration, stay pretty much the same, both in terms of rhetoric and in terms of policy. Can you talk a little bit about why that's problematic and what that looks like, especially given what you just laid out with the increased escalation?
Yeah, that's a great question. After this past week, between multiple countrywide demonstrations in Israel by Israeli protesters, and then the raid on Nablus, which has since left dozens killed and wounded in its aftermath, I would say naive to think that we were going to get a stern reaction from the U.S. Because after all, we do in this case have a huge segment of Israelis and American Jews that are asking the Biden administration to act against the Netanyahu administration. So I thought there might be something different this time around with the increased violence. But it disappointed us. Again, we heard more language about the need for both sides to kind of calm down for the de-escalation and the violence. And it wasn't just too late, but it was too out of touch with the severity of the moment and the escalation of the violence and how out of control it's gotten. And that's really scary, because if the US is, and it's really problematic, because if it's not going to intervene, then at least it shouldn't carry this posture of we're going to hold we're going to have democratic values and promote those, whether in Ukraine or elsewhere in the world, because people here in this region are watching these things, and they're watching these double standards, that when it comes to Palestinians, human rights don't actually matter. Democratic values, well, there's the sovereignty of Israel, and we're not going to step on Israel's toes, even if there are Israeli politicians that have been affiliated with terrorist organizations, or if those politicians go and incite violence, and then there is increased violence, and so many things happen. But the Biden administration is still trying to play this kind of safe and not issue a strong enough response or use American leverage here. And as a result, what happens is not only are Palestinians killed, but Israelis are killed. And an Israeli American was killed in the aftermath of this. He was shot near the Dead Sea. So it's not in the American public's interest, it's not in the Palestinian people's interest, and it's especially not in the Israeli public interest. Maybe the only people benefiting from this are the likes of Netanyahu, Ben-Gvir, and Smotrich, who are feeding off people's fears and fanning the flames for their own political interest.
Yeah, well, I mean, this unholy dynamic, I think, Jack, you so expertly charted that out, but there is an unholy dynamic here, which is giving free rein to folks who have professed real violent ambitions. And I just want to put a pin in that, because something both Sarah and Jack, you referenced earlier, were the protests primarily by Israeli Jews for Israeli democracy. So the new administration in Israel is trying to restructure the government and limit the power of the judiciary. And there's a small but very vocal minority of Israeli Jews who are protesting this and recognizing that this is really transforming Israel from the democracy that that many believed it once was. And if you saw the images of these protests recently, these protesters are protesting nonviolently in Israel, and they're often being arrested. But there's no accountability for settlers in the West Bank going and burning Palestinian towns and villages and olive groves and literally murdering people. Instead, you have an Israeli minister say that, on Twitter, say that, he thought what was happening in Hawara, the village outside of Nablus, where 11 people were killed the other night, was a good thing, and that the Israeli government needs to go in and wipe Hawara out, take it off the map, and there's no repercussion to that. And so how that relates back to America is that, we have helped create the conditions here. We often talk, at Telos about the principles and practices of peacemaking. There's one foundational principle, this core bedrock of peacemaking that we describe as nonviolence. And nonviolence is important in thinking about not just in sort of this airy-fairy kumbaya, let's all be peaceful together. That's obviously, we live in a competitive world in which power matters and hard power matters. So there's a lot to say about nonviolence, but for me, the first step in really understanding the significance of nonviolence is really getting clear on what violence is. So we're very quick to condemn direct violence, like the wrongful shooting of that Israeli American and killing of that Israeli American near Jericho in the West Bank, or what people are terming these pogroms, on Palestinian towns and villages. Now, that's important. That's direct violence, and it's important to condemn that if we want to create conditions where everyone there can flourish. Everyone has their fundamental human rights. But what we often fail to condemn is structural violence. These are these systems that exist. One exists in Israel today, and others have existed and exist in other parts of the world, in which one group of people controls another. And so that's just the reality on the ground today. How we got there is very complicated, but that's structural or systemic violence. And namely, like, for example, very clearly, the occupation, this military regime, which means that if you're Palestinian, you don't have agency over your life. And this is how generations of Palestinians have lived. And so when you get a statement from the Biden administration that's talking about both sides as if they are equal parties, which they are not, to de-escalate the violence, great. Yeah, I mean, nobody should be going around killing civilians at all. But when there's no condemnation of the fundamental condition of structural violence, which can only produce rotten fruit, which is more and more violence for everyone, that's problematic. So I think there's something problematic there, but there's also an opportunity in a moment that's as dark and dangerous as this. I mean, I have to be very honest. I'm headed out there in a few days. I'm really worried for my family. I'm really worried for my friends. I think we're entering a very, very dark period for this part of the world. And so I feel awkward even saying that there's opportunity in this moment, but I know that one of the reasons why this conflict has persisted so long is because of the international community's failure to be as zealous in condemning structural violence and seeking to remedy that as it does direct violence. And so by reframing this as a human rights issue, getting our leaders to speak about this and hold themselves accountable to fundamental human rights, recognizing that Israelis and Palestinians of every stripe and faith and none are equal human beings, and that from that recognition, that whether or not we believe in God, for those who do that, everyone's created equal in the image of God, all of our policy, everything must flow from that. That is an incredible step forward to hopefully create the conditions in which we can finally talk about this period of real injustice as history and not a present reality.
There's so much in there that I want to unpack from what you both just said, and so many pieces that are so important. And I want to pick up on all of them and do measure. But I think for me, I am not Israeli or Palestinian. I am an American who's invested in this, who cares deeply. And when you talk about opportunity, I don't think that's at all a wrong way to think about it. We care about this beyond when it's just in the headlines, but when it's in the headlines, we have that opportunity because other people are paying attention in a way they might not be when we still care, but it's not as visible. And so in these moments when more people do have a chance to see what's going on, to lean into webinars like this, to learn the deeper story and learn about the structural violence, Greg, as you were describing, I think this is exactly the time where, because we care and because we have that access to our communities, sharing our thoughts and feelings, holding our elected officials accountable is absolutely appropriate. And I'll turn to that a little bit later. But right now I want to bring in one other piece of violence. And so Greg, you talked about structural and direct violence, but the third kind of leg of that is also cultural violence. And that one can be hard to define too, but a lot of times words and rhetoric and language are part of cultural violence, especially statements made by elected officials. And Jack, I want to bring you back in here to unpack a statement that I'm going to quote kind of at length. Greg, you referenced this earlier with Minister Smotrich. So after the events of the attack on the village of Hawara by about 400 settlers, the Israeli finance minister Smotrich liked a tweet that was talking about wiping the village off Palestine. He was asked to clarify, and I'm going to quote his response for you because it really kind of horrified me in a way that just knowing this goes on doesn't. So I quote, "The village of Hawara needs to be wiped out. I think that the state of Israel needs to do that, not, God forbid, private individuals." That's pretty horrifying from a minister in a government. And I also want to quote the State Department response, because I think that's really telling too, getting at what we were saying and what Jack was saying about don't just state values without backing it up. So State Department spokesman Ned Price said, and I quote, "I want to be very clear about this. These comments were irresponsible, they were repugnant, they were disgusting, and just as we condemn Palestinian incitement of violence, we condemn these provocative remarks that also amount to incitement to violence. We call on Prime Minister Netanyahu and other senior Israeli officials to publicly and clearly reject and disavow these comments. We condemn, as we have consistently, terrorism and extremism in all of its forms, and we continue to urge that there will be equal measures of accountability for extremist actions, regardless of the background of the perpetrators or the victims." End quote. Jack, that's a lot to throw at you and ask us to help unpack. But I'm going to do that. I'm going to put you on the spot because this is a pretty clear statement. And yet Smotrich is due to visit DC next week. He's going to be welcomed in. He's going to be engaged with as a leader of a country. When do you think, or how do you think we'll see the US go beyond condemnations, not just of incitements to violence, but of the actual structural, cultural, direct violence itself that we've been talking about?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? I mean, Ned Price says we'll urge that there'll be equal measures of accountability for extremist actions. So who's gonna, hold Smotrich accountable? Is he expecting Netanyahu to? Netanyahu kind of signed off a big portion. He struck a deal with Smotrich and Ben-Gvir both in the coalition agreement to give them a lot of things that they wanted. One of the things that Smotrich wanted was control over the COGAT, the military administration that runs the occupation, essentially, it has administrative control over the West Bank and Gaza. And so in recreating and reshuffling his responsibilities, Smotrich, this person that has incited for violence, has actually taken control of that huge part of the Israeli Ministry of Defense, right? And so when we're talking about, calling on Netanyahu and other senior Israeli officials, this is a senior Israeli official that you're calling on. This is not some person in the opposition that's making, that's not really relevant to the politics. This is the person that's in charge of the military. This is the person that's in charge of land confiscations, evictions, new settlements, all these things that are part of structural violence, which is why it's so, and I can't agree with you more, Greg, this is why it's so necessary for the US to, first of all, kind of acknowledge the structural violence. If it doesn't acknowledge the structural violence, then it can kind of say that this is kind of a headless monster. There's these extremists that are out there that are not part of necessarily the Israeli government, or they don't have significant roles in the Israeli government. That's what that comment reads to me like. If there is accountability for extremist factions within Israeli government, Like there was accountability, by the way, for Palestinian factions. This Israeli government was elected democratically. By the way, Hamas, the terrorist organization as part of the Palestinian government, was elected democratically. And the US boycotted that government. And it has laws in place that no American can come into contact with Hamas. So why is there again double standards? The double standard is in the root of the problem, which Greg outlined, where the US does not see that the military occupation is a form of violence. It sees it as a legitimate system in place over the lives of Palestinians in order to secure Israelis. So it's essentially playing into this false dichotomy that persecuting Palestinians will make Israelis safer. We have to deconstruct that. We have to kind of unpack that. And we have to push the American administration to do better and talk better, at least use the right language in order to transform this conflict. The future we're working for is a future beyond the occupation, and not just to end the occupation, but beyond the occupation where both sides of this flourish and both sides live. And no matter when one state, two states, five states, it doesn't really matter, but it's in order for that transformation to happen, we have to address the core issues.
And Sarah, I know you want to get quickly to Q&A and action, but I just want to draw a little bit off of what Jack said, because I think this is important to hold. And I know many folks on this call are really well adept at political advocacy and organization, and some are newer to this. I want those who are newer to this to understand that part of the reason that we get to these places is, quite frankly, Palestinians are not seen as equal human beings by many. And so, you know, the way that we talk about this in the US is this presumption, this assumption that like Israel is a good democratic state and Palestinians are somehow problematic and violent and terrorists. And we have all these associations with Palestinians that see Palestinians as somehow less than human. Now, when you have that, and you have statements which go unchecked about Arabs, Palestinians, Muslims, whomever it is, women, LGBTQ, that's cultural violence that allows for these attitudes that see some people as less than human. And when we have that kind of pervasive cultural violence, that enables so many other things to take place completely unnoticed, or in fact, sometimes sanctified. So the reason why I'm holding that point is that I know we're going to get to action, but for some people on this call, so action in a place like America that is so influential in determining what happens on the ground over there, that, you know, that action, it could be political advocacy, but it could be really diving deep into your communities where people have these unconscious biases and may not see Palestinians as equal human beings, deserving of security, deserving of rights, making sure that Palestinian voices are heard and platformed in your communities. Just having these conversations about your trips, about your journey into understanding this place and these people differently, and our connection as Americans, that is fundamentally important to one day shifting this really violent dynamic, which is a container that allows so much of what we see to happen that we lament to continue happening.
Thanks for that, Greg, and thanks for what you said before, Jack. I want to pick up on, I think, what both of you have mentioned a couple of times now, this question of security, and really dive into what we mean by that. And I want to pick back up on Jack's comment about security through deterrence for Israelis, and why that hasn't led to security for Israelis or security, freedom, or dignity for Palestinians. When we talk about being pro Telos, we talk about the fact that you can't have freedom, dignity, security for Israelis without also having it for Palestinians. And in moments where we don't see the violence, or it looks like there might be security for one, or those three for one, but not the other, that's kind of a false illusion. It's not really security. It's that kind of temporary, keeping the lid on a boiling pot. Greg or Jack, can you talk a little bit more or lay out, you know, as concretely as possible, why it is so important to understand that security for Israelis only comes through security for Palestinians, and what we can do to advocate for that.
Well, I think very quickly on this point, Jackie may have more depth, but historically, we only talk about securities for Israelis. Palestinians are ones who live in incredibly vulnerable positions, typically throughout the West Bank, Gaza Strip, even not as equal citizens within the Israel itself, in refugee camps around the Middle East. And so recognizing that if we are equal human beings, Palestinians actually deserve security too, is a small but important shift. I think there can be a lot said for, the interdependence of these peoples. As Jack mentioned, it's such a tiny place, but, and the idea that of mutual flourishing is a term we use a lot at Telos, this idea that, we must be working towards a time in which everyone can flourish, ideally on their own terms. Everyone has agency. Our culture, our institutions conspire for that. Another shorthand way to describe that would be systemic justice. We talk a lot about systemic injustice, but what about systemic justice? That's what we're working towards. But fundamental to all of that, fundamental to the work of a nation state, is protecting security. And so security discourse has often been weaponized, I think, not just in Israel, Palestine, but around the world. But security is something that all of us want in our personal lives and our communities. And so I think that really bringing security back into human rights discourse, and particularly centering those stories of the marginalized, those who are most vulnerable, and saying, wait a second, this is not normal for these people to continually experience this violence. This is actually wrong, and they're just as deserving of security as we are, and this other group is fundamentally important.
Yeah, I guess what I'll just add in here is like that instance where my parents saw, so right before they saw that the house was set on fire across the street, my dad had told my mom to close the blinds because there was an army jeep just outside the house. So there was an army jeep, they closed the blinds, and then when they opened up the blinds again, the army was gone and this house was set on fire. So most of the neighborhood there where my parents live are convinced that the army actually had set this house on fire. Now, whether they did or whether they were onlookers as individual, settlers did it or other people, the point that is communicated is, I mean, if the house across the street from you is set on fire by people, and you're Palestinian, and so your car downstairs or your house might be next, who do you call? If the army is going to be on looking as this happen, and they're the ultimate kind of power and control, who's the police? Who's your sense of security? So my parents are just left calling me and trying to get me to tell them what to do. And I just said, just move your cars to the back of the building and just sit tight and let me know if anything happens. So they're not going to do anything. But what about younger kids that have been born into this and just seen this time and time and time again, and that sense of insecurity at the highest level, that the state is against you, isn't itself going to create despair and create a sense of vigilantism or a sense of just revenge and wanting to hit back. And that's what I, from the videos that my mom sent me and stuff, I just saw these young men out there trying to put out the fire and stuff. And that's what I just kept thinking, that this is how people get so mad that they feel so powerless, that and this isn't new to us, because MLK said this, that the voice of the powerless, the voice of the voiceless is violence. And I'm paraphrasing, I'm doing a bad job at it, but this is how the future of these two people, the security of these two people, is connected, really. And for all of us everywhere. And so what does mutual flourishing look like? It looks like, first of all, dismantling systems of oppression, systems of security, while at the same time building systems of trust, and that are reliant on each other for peace. So my peace depends on your peace. When my peace depends on your peace instead of my insecurity depending on your insecurity, then there's a whole different formula at play, and people will go out of their way to make sure that their neighbor has peace. But unfortunately, we're living in the opposite kind of realm. Yeah, and it seems like such a simple piece of this puzzle, but but I will say, reading a few articles here and there after the aftermath of all these developments, I did see there is some hope, because I did see more and more people, more and more Israelis, and in mainstream circles, people questioning this whole equation. This, okay, if we hit them harder, are they going to just submit? No, more Israelis are going to be killed. And so, some people on the kind of more left side of the aisle were pointing the finger at Netanyahu and saying he's trying to divert attention, and they were questioning the timing of the Nablus raids amidst the height of the mass protest movement and all this. But I think, I don't know whether it's the resentment towards Netanyahu or the timing of this, but there is some momentum towards that paradigm shifting. So the more people on this call and our broader network can push on those buttons, kind of shifting the paradigm of security and insecurity for both Israelis and Palestinians, the quicker we'll see a shift in the whole conflict.
Thanks for that, Jack. I want to touch on what you said about that sense of powerlessness, which I think is incredibly true for young Palestinians, young Israelis we see out protesting, Americans, not just young, but everyone who cares deeply about this. And before we turn to some questions from the chat that I want to draw us into, I want to have time first to really talk about where do we land? Where do we land after this webinar, where we've thrown a lot of information at you and a lot of really heavy information. And I think in this moment, it's also easy as people who, are third parties, Americans or Canadians, or people who care deeply about what happens to Israelis and Palestinians, but aren't Israeli or Palestinian, to feel that sense of powerlessness too. And sometimes a sense of hopelessness of, well, it's such a big problem, like I can't do anything, where do I start? One of the things that's really important to remember is that we do have agency. We have agency as Americans, we have agency as peacemakers in our communities, as Greg said. And so we have the opportunity to help make some of that culture change and put pressure politically to get us to a place where we are able to use our voices and our influence and share the stories that we've heard from Israelis and Palestinians working for peace to try and bring about this political shift. So I want to touch on the two things that we think will make change and where we can own our agency as Americans. One is cultural. As Greg was saying, we believe that culture change is upstream of politics. So the more we share about Israelis and Palestinians working together for futures of mutual flourishing in our communities, challenging those narratives, the more we address that cultural harm and pave the way for there to be cultural peace in our own country when we talk about these issues. So that's really important. Those small conversations, just sharing those stories you've heard, moving the needle a little bit matters. Then the other piece is that political pressure in the US is important. As we've talked about, our government has stated values around human rights. And as Jack was saying, you can't just state values without backing them up, or else they get eroded. So our government's done the first step. They've stated these are values they hold. They've talked about that language of freedom and dignity and security for Israelis and Palestinians, even if they mean it slightly differently than Telos does. So now it's our chance to hold them to that. The Biden administration has said that. So we get to put pressure and say, you said this, let's align our actions with values. And it's not that easy. Not that simple. I don't want to be naively optimistic about this, but I do want to bring in something that I always come back to from one of our Palestinian pastor partners, Mitri Raheb, who says, hope is what you do. And in these moments where we do feel powerlessness or hopelessness, hope is what we do. And so I'd encourage you all, Micah will drop a link in the chat, but I encourage you to look up who your members of Congress are. And some might be more hospitable to this, some might be totally against this. But to challenge yourself to send them an email talking about why you care in this moment, why you care about a future of mutual flourishing for Israelis and Palestinians. And it might not feel like it matters, but it does. And that's our right as folks who have elected representatives who are supposedly representing our interests on this issue. And the more of us who can use our voices in that way to advocate in nuanced ways for mutual flourishing and for human rights, the more we start changing that culture not just in our communities, but in government. I see a couple of questions in the chat that touch on that too, like caring about Palestinian lives, caring about mutual flourishing isn't politically expedient. And so we have to put pressure so that it becomes more acceptable for folks in a strategic way as well. That's a lot for me. I know there's a lot in there. Michael put in the chat a link not just to how to find your members of Congress, but also to a petition from J Street that's about judicial reform. That's an issue we didn't really touch on a whole lot, but it is an organized petition out there. And I'll start with that question for a brief time for question and answers, and I'll pull the two together that I've seen. So there has been a lot of Israeli protests around the suggested changes or abolishment of some of the judiciary powers. But as Jeff notes in the comments, a lot of those voices have been about, right, this is for Israel, this is an internal Israeli issue. They're not really bringing in issues of occupation. Would either of you like to speak to that a little bit and speak to the importance about advocating for mutual flourishing and not just taking these issues and picking apart who benefits where?
Yeah, no, I do want to speak to this, and this will be a little bit sensitive, but I think it's important for us to have this conversation. I think we've talked a lot about the importance of working towards mutual flourishing. It's our North Star, but we're at a time here in Israel, Palestine, at least between Israelis and Palestinians, where there is no equality. One group actually has control over the other, despite the existence of a Palestinian Authority, which can't freely move between its own towns even. And so I think, in response to Jeff's question, I think there are two things happening. One, for change, we do have to have in-group conversations. And there is finally some real in-group conversation happening among Israeli Jews, evangelical Christians here in the US, and this is important. And every group fundamentally first sees the world primarily through their own interest. That's natural, that's human. We have survival interest. We care about what's ours. We're obviously working to something beyond that, where we recognize the interdependency of all of us as individuals and groups and want to recreate or create a world in which that interdependency is really what binds us together, and there's a mutuality there, as you mentioned, Sarah. But what I want to suggest here is that, one of the things that I think many communities who are not Palestinian can do that may be difficult is to really platform Palestinian voices. Palestinian voices are often listened to last, or only if they're in service of this idea of, well, we have to do this to preserve Israeli democracy or Zionism. I think this is why fundamental human rights is so important. I can understand, I can empathize with some of my Jewish friends who have been concerned about 2 millennia of rabid anti-Semitism and seeing it continually to rear its ugly head. This is another conversation for another time. I personally believe that anti-Semitism and Palestinian rights and liberation, the fight against anti-Semitism, the fight for Palestinian are very much intertwined. They should not be opposed to each other. And I think the past decades have been an historical anomaly rather, as they're fighting against some of the same forces. And so I think it's really important. Imagine if there's a shift from this discourse that is just primarily about protecting Israel's character as a Jewish and democratic state to something that is really rooted in fundamental human rights. I'll tell you, as a Palestinian American, and again, I'm speaking very sensitively here, and so I'm not representative of anyone myself, but my own experience. My view is that I think that a lot of the coalition building that we need to do in order to see change, that's meaning really building alliances, among certain Jewish groups, Palestinian groups, other interested parties who see the importance of this conflict. It's really difficult to do that when the only frame that some of your partners will allow you to consider is a Zionist frame. Like that feels, when the reality on the ground for Palestinians is when it's like, I don't even have any safety in my home or my identity. And now look at this new government here, like very explicitly targeting us, which we've been targeted, historically right now. That's a problem. I think the human rights frame is definitely supporting of fundamental human rights for Israelis, Israeli Jews, Jews worldwide as well. And I do think there is an opportunity to co-create a new movement with that foundation, which will allow for more diverse stakeholders who recognize that our realities are in fact intertwined, and that while we might be able to secure security for one party with force in the short term, this is not headed anywhere good in the long term. And so we really need to use our power now to readjust and redirect things if we can.
It's a great answer, Greg. If you're wondering where to get started with some of that practically, I'd point you to our principles and practices, which can be helpful tools in doing some of what Greg just laid out. What you described is exactly that idea of centering the voices of the marginalized, or the fact that the folks who are closest to a problem often have the most insight about that problem and potential solutions, which is so true about Palestinian voices when it comes to occupation and mutual flourishing for Palestinians. And I know that can be challenging, which is why our first two practices of peacemaking are listening to understand and holding competing perspectives in tension. And I'd invite you all to check those out and to lean into those two things. If you're hearing perspectives and voices that are challenging you, sit there in that tension for a little while, hold that perspective. You don't have to decide if you agree with it or disagree with it right away. There's room to do a lot of learning and listening before we have to arrive at any kind of thing that looks anything like a consensus or action. And so that's a great invitation, Greg, to try and lean into listening to some Palestinian voices, listening to understand and holding that intention with maybe historical truths that you've been, or historical perspectives that you've brought with you to this conversation. I recognize we're running out of time. Greg or Jack, any last comments? I'm so sorry we didn't get to all the questions.
I want Jack to have the last word, but one small point quickly for this audience. There are a lot of Christians on this audience listening today. Please understand you have enormous opportunity. This situation on the ground, this struggle, is partly authored by certain segments of the Christian church. And that goes all the way back to Balfour and before. And so when you're considering about action, please write your member of Congress, have friends over, watch a video, share a story, but also think about the reality that Christian nationalism, including Christian Zionism, is on the rise. You have the power to cast an alternative vision. And there are many folks in our network who we could connect you to if you're not already connected, who can do that with you. But that's incredibly important for this issue and so many other issues around the world. And you're really well positioned to have undue positive influence in this world. So please see that as an opportunity as well.
Jack, any last thoughts?
I was going to attempt to answer our friend Heather's question, because it's tied to also Jeff's question about the public protests and Zionism and all that. And that's just, there's a lot happening here. It provides a real opportunity, a real moment. There's still a lot of work to be done, to be honest. The public protests are incredible for multiple reasons. It's been 8 straight weeks with 150 to 200,000 Israelis that have come out to voice their concern for the future of Israel. There's a big missing aspect of that, and that's the occupation, because the majority of the protesters don't see the connection between the people that are trying to strip democratic elements of Israeli governance and the occupation. And those that have pushed for settlement and annexation and the continued expulsion of Palestinians through different means did this through non-democratic military power and by force. So now these forces have come out of the activist space, and now they're the policymakers of the country. So there's a clear connection between these two elements. And so the missing piece, the missing part of this is really to keep pushing forward. This is good that there's an internal conversation, as Greg was saying. But there's the missing piece are the Palestinians here. But I think in any part, we've seen how social movements work in the past, and within a month or a year or a short amount of time, we can have a completely different reality. So I would just encourage folks to keep having these tough conversations with their communities. If they have access to people in political representatives, take the time, please email, write a letter, a phone call, anything you can do to push, because we are in a really sensitive kind of turning point. And I really appreciate everyone that's coming out.
and join the Telos Learning Corps. Like,
Thanks
then
for
we
that
can
segue,
move.
Greg. Yeah, that's what I was going to invite you all to do too. Please continue these conversations in your communities. But if you enjoyed today's conversation and you're looking for more of this type of place to engage with other folks from across the country and Canada who care deeply about mutual flourishing in Israelis and Palestinians, consider signing up for the Learning Corps. The idea is to have more of these types of spaces and conversations when we don't have such a big crowd, and we don't have so much to cover. They're a little more conversational, so we'll get to talk to one another and ask more questions. Sorry we didn't get to all of those today, but that's a community where we not only learn, but we also push each other to act, and to act in really, brave ways when it comes to taking the kinds of actions we've described today. So I'd love to see you on future Learning Corps calls. For today, thanks so much for taking the time to join us, and thanks to Greg and Jack for sharing. I know this is, especially for you, Jack, incredibly personal and right on your doorstep. So really, really appreciate all your insights, and we will see you all hopefully next time. Take care.
Thank you.